Okay, so that gives you some orientation, first of all, around the kind of on-save instance state part, which is pretty important for most Android apps. It's pretty important that if I turn the screen sideways, that the user doesn't lose data. So it's something we pay a lot of attention to. The other thing that I want to talk about, and this is really the main thrust of what I want to go through today, is talk about something called the master detail flow. And how does that go with these kind of adaptive layouts that we've been trying to build, right, in this responsive design idea. So, oftentimes, and this is what we've done so far, right, on a phone, it makes sense to have the movie list or the list of things on one screen, and then the details for that particular thing on a separate screen. Make sense? That's what we've done so far, right? Is we've said, here is the list of things. If you want to see details on it, you tap it, and it appears on a new screen. Okay? Which is perfectly fine and is really our only option on phones. Okay? But from a tablet perspective, it's generally a big waste of space. On anything bigger than a smartphone, it's usually a huge waste of space to do it that way. Okay? Because we have a lot more horizontal space, what we tend to do instead is we'll put the list on the left, the details on the right, and then anytime you pick something, it doesn't completely replace the screen, it just switches what appears on the right. And you'll see a lot of popular email clients do this. For instance, if you look at Outlook has this very exact behavior. If you bring it on a tablet or larger devices, then you get this behavior where the list of emails is on the left and email that you're reading is on the right. Okay? The problem is this comes with a lot of gotchas. It's something that doesn't fit well into our usual method of, oh, let's just create two different layouts, right? Which is traditionally how we've done it. Remember, we said here I'm going to create a phone layout and a tablet layout, but that would mean that this layout here on the left would contain all of the stuff from the movie list and all the stuff from the movie details. And in fact, I would have to completely re-implement all of the logic that goes into the detail screen also into the list screen, right? That would result in a lot of code duplication, okay? So part of my goal with teaching you how to do this is to teach you to do it in a way that significantly reduces how much code duplication that you have. Solve some of the common bugs that usually come up with that sort of shift, and just overall how to get there, okay? So everybody following with me? This is what we're trying to get to. This is going to take a little bit. It's going to take a bit of refactoring to get from where we are here over to here, okay? One of the things to be very, very aware of is we're not getting rid of this flow. We're not getting rid of the flow where on phones, they are two separate screens. This still needs to work, right? It needs to work both on phones and on tablets, but differently, okay? So one of the things I talked about previously was this idea of a fragment, okay? Remember, a fragment is sort of a mini activity, and it's something that I can actually use that then logic, that bit of UI, I can actually use it on more than one screen. Fragments are really, really helpful for this, because what I can do is I can say the movie list is a fragment, the movie details is also a fragment, and so then it's not a big deal for them to be on two separate screens or to show two fragments simultaneously. You following with me? So if I can get both of these to be fragments, then it makes the whole flow a lot easier. And so that's step one. Step one is to make both of those things fragments. Okay? Good news is we've done half of that work already, right? We went ahead and did the bottom navigation approach for switching between users and movies or games and movies. And so we've already made this list into a fragment. Okay, so that conversion's already happened. I just need to repeat that conversion with the details. Is everybody following with me there? I do want to go through this with you, even though we've done it before. It's been a while since we did it. And it's also, there are some other gotchas you're going to get to with the detail screen that you didn't get with the list. Okay? So step one is we're going to make that conversion. Okay, we're going to convert it to be a fragment. The detail screen is going to be using a fragment instead of all the code being in the activity. And then we'll do the conversion from there. Okay, so we're going to get that working first, fragments and fragments, the phone workflow, and then we're going to go and go to the tablet workflow from there. Okay, so if you're looking at the lab assignment, I've actually added some really specific instructions because there's a lot of things that need to be done. So I have kind of spelled out like do this and then do this and do this in this order. I would recommend kind of following along with this as we're going through this process. Okay? So, step one is I'm going to go rename the layout. This is not one of those things that really has to be done, but it helps a lot when somebody's coming back and looking at the code and trying to figure out where things are and how things work, right? So what I want to do is what we previously called activity movie details. I'm going to rename that. Refactor, rename. And I'm going to rename it to just movie details because sometimes it's going to be an activity and sometimes it's going to be a fragment, if that makes sense, right? Effectively, it's always going to be a fragment, but the fact that it's whether it's an activity or fragment no longer matters. So that's why I'm just going to call it movie details. In fact, you could argue for a lot of these that it maybe shouldn't have the acronym, shouldn't have the name activity or fragment in front of it because of this very reason. So movie details I'm going to rename. I also need to rename the scroll layout that I have that goes with it. So refactor, rename. So now I have movie details and movie details scroll. I might go look through some of these other ones that I have at this time and start to kind of think about my names again, right? In fact, if I kind of think about how some of these work, even some of these ones that I've named, maybe movie, item movie, or item review, maybe some of these would be better named as refactor, rename. This might be more a movie item or a movie summary. Yeah, I'll go with item. Rename. I'll just flip those names so that they stay together. So I've got a movie item, a movie list, movie details, and this is going to be refactor, rename. This is review, item. This one would be maybe just rename it to my profile. Maybe just log in for these. Oop.
You renamed the scroll layout as well?
I renamed the scroll layout as well. Okay. So step one is I'm just going to rename a bunch of these layouts just to get back to a more sensical sort of naming scheme, mostly to get out of like what we already had being done, which makes kind of less sense now. Yeah, I'm going to take a quick snip of what my names are now and toss that on Discord so it's a little bit bigger. So that's how I've renamed things. I've gotten rid of the idea that any of these are really activities anymore. There's one in here called Fragment Container. Don't worry about that one right now. I'll talk about that one in a second. But that's where I would start renaming your layouts. Okay? Does everybody got that? Is everybody still working on renaming? You're still working on renaming? So I'm kind of going down to a simpler naming scheme, right? Because the idea is where we're headed actually is that almost everything in your app is going to be a fragment instead of an activity in the app. But I don't want to make assumptions about what's a fragment and what's an activity. Okay. Now, what I want to introduce is the new Fragment class. So we know that under movie, I've already got a movie list fragment. If we take a quick look and a review of that, notice movie list fragment extends fragment. Also remember that there are two fragment classes. There's an Android fragment, and there's an Android X fragment. Okay, and so this one is the newer Android X fragment. Okay, which is important partly because of something we just did. The older fragments don't have an on-save instance state method. That's a new addition to fragments. They didn't used to have that support. So we had to oftentimes juggle things and somehow get that code into the activity because the activity ended up having to do the saving. Okay, cool. Okay, so in terms of creating this, so I'm going to create a new Java class, just a brand new Java class. This is going to be my movie details fragment. In your case, this would be the game details fragment. Okay, so I'm going to create the movie details fragment. It is a class. And yes, I want to add that. And so this is going to extend the fragment class. Okay. So notice that there are two fragment classes that are popping up. So everybody see that? Android X fragment, and the other one is Android app fragment. Make sure that you pick the Android X one of those two. Okay. Make sure you're picking Android X. So I'm going to click on that, and my import should look like what I have above. Okay? So if your input looks the same as mine, you're in the right place. If it doesn't, then you want to import it again at that instead. Okay? If I think about how things are structured, remember that most of my code is in Oncreate. At most, I want to look at kind of what the details activity looks like right now, and maybe do a survey of that. So if I go up top and look at what is all in here, right? So I've got I've got some constants, I've got some views, I've got some state variables. I've got an onCreate method. I've got onSave instance state, on option item selected, on back pressed, handle web link, right? So I have all of these instance fields and a bunch of methods, okay? I would want to work with this conversion, work from top to bottom, okay? So number one is all of the instance fields. Now, the good news is with those is I can largely just copy them over. I can largely just take everything that I have here and copy it into the fragment with a few exceptions. Okay, so my fragment's going to start out like that. I'm just going to bring all of my fields over. Okay. Now, one of the things that I do need to change is up in the constants. Notice that this is no longer movie details activity. This is movie details fragment. So I need to make sure I update the log tag to refer to the new class. Okay. Also, the second extra that I have here extra movie ID, okay, that refers to an intent. Fragments are not allowed to access the intent. You can access the intent in the activity, but not the fragment. Okay, so that actually doesn't appear here. It will appear in the activity, but it will not appear in the fragment. Okay? All right, so the rest of this is going to stay the same. All of the views that I had in the activity are now going to be over here and referenced in the fragment. Same thing with these state variables. I still need these over in fragment forms. Okay? Now, next thing would be to migrate over the code for Oncreate. But do remember that this is a little bit different. So I need to say on view created, and you can see it popping up here. Okay. So on view created. I'm going to override that, which is going to start reading with this template. Okay. If we look at our other fragment that we created, the movie list fragment, okay, you might notice that there was an additional step that we had to do, that we had to define a constructor before we could get into OnViewCreated, because the constructor tells it what layout to use. Okay, so I do again need a constructor for this fragment. So that's going to go right here. Public movie details fragment super r dot layout dot movie details scroll. Import. Oh, nope, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to import R. There it goes. So it should look something like this. Okay. And so the next part of that is to look through the Oncreate method and do the conversion that we need there. Okay? Everybody on board? Mm-hmm. So, starting at Oncreate here, you'll notice the first line that we did is to call set content view. So set content view, that's how that works for an activity versus where we specify the layout is in the constructor on the fragment side. Okay, so life cycle is a little bit different. The thing that comes after that, I'm going to start with just verbatim bringing them over. So starting from this section I've labeled find views all the way down to the end of the function. I'm going to take this, copy it, move it in. Okay. There's going to be some things that are broken, and that's okay. It's okay that there are a few things that are broken.
You copied the entire Uncreate?
Except for the line at the beginning that said set content view. Mm-hmm. Okay. That one thing I left out. So step one is to do this conversion to turn it into a fragment. Okay. And so you just have to kind of walk through some of the issues that you've run into. Okay. So find view by ID, you might notice that's red. Red meaning it can't find it. Okay. It says it can't find this find view by ID function. Okay. If I look and review the previous fragment we created, notice what I had to do is I'd refer to the first parameter in OnViewCreated. Okay, the first parameter is that view. So rather than saying find view by ID, it needs to be view.find view by ID. So all of these I need to switch over. View.find find view ID, so I'm going to write that out once and then just copy it. Problem number 1 down. Okay, so problem number 1 down is just how to convert the find view values. I'm going to keep scrolling down until we see the next error. And it looks like pretty good until I get down here with my observers. So anytime I call observe, I now have an error because I'm passing this as the first argument, which was previously the activity, right? But now this refers to a fragment, okay? The first argument to observe, remember, needs to be a life cycle owner, okay? And so the activity is a life cycle owner, but we are not a life cycle owner, right? If we look at the other one we converted over, we had the same problem. And so if you look in there, it's referring to life cycle owner. And so where did we get that? We got that
Right there on line 66.
line 66. Yeah, there it is. So on line 66, we got the activity and we got the life cycle owner because we needed those depending on context, depending on where we're using it. So right now I'm just going to grab the life cycle owner. And I'm going to put that in here. And so for all of those observes, the first argument is going to go over to lifecycle owner instead of being this. So that effectively have it behave the same way, where those observers are going to get active when the views are on screen and deactive when the views are not on screen. And the fragments on screen, not on screen. Okay. Any other errors? So we switched over to lifecycle owner. Actually, I see one right here.
Yeah, our adapter is looking for a context.
It's looking for a context, right? So remember that context, when we're working with the adapter, both with the layout manager and the review list and the adapter, these are actually both have to be in activity. Okay. So I need to in here say, what do we call it? We had fragment activity is equal to that. And so those are both going to get the activity. And I think from my review list adapter, I think I incorrectly marked that as being app compat activity, but I think this just needs to be activity. So I can go over and fix the adapter real quick. Any other errors that you have in your fragments? Do they have any other issues that there are errors you're seeing in your game view placement? So notice you need the activity to set up, create that. So we'll get the fragment activity. We'll call them get activity. And for the observed, you need to like something. So that one's going to be resolved by passing the activity. And then over here, so and that was a fragment activity. That's an activity. So going to the adapter, the problem is that this should have been just activity and not activity. So change that over there. Make sure it's in here. There it goes. There it goes. And so if you go back, that should result in that.
So, Mr. Smith,
Yes.
regarding all of my button set on click listeners,
Uh-huh.
you kind of have to describe a view local
Yeah.
variable as the lambda.
Okay.
And
So where's the set on click listener?
They're
So
all at the bottom.
so here,
So we just have to give it a different name because there's already view at the top in on.
yes. Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I wish that at the top that they had called it something different. That is a good thing to point out. If I look at the movie list fragment, did I have that same problem? I did have that same problem because they're called view up there.
Do we have any buttons?
So I don't think I do.
In movie list buttons.
So on the movie list, I do have that issue, but the difference is here I have an anonymous class instead of a lambda.
Ah, that's right.
And so the anonymous class works differently in that sense.
It's a different scope.
Yeah, it does create another scope, but this does not create another scope, which is good. I actually want that from a lambda. Okay. So I've got two options, right? I can either rename the variable that's down here, or I can rename the variable up top. And rename the one down here, or I can rename the one at the top. Okay. Usually when I get into this situation where I have two things named the same thing, it usually means that both names are bad. Right? If there's two places where these mean something different in different contexts, that's usually a sign that whatever name I picked in both places was a bad choice in the first place.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So usually what I do to try and get me out of this mess is I rename it in both places. Okay? So what I would do is I would go up to the top, and this view in particular, I would rename this one first.
If you do that, is it going to change all the views in your lambda as well?
I don't think it will. I hope not. So I'm going to say rename code occurrence. I'm going to rename this to content view.
Okay.
And I think I can get a preview because you can see what's in green, what it's going to change. And it looks like it's not going to change those. So that's what I would do is number one is change the name of this up top. Is change it to content view instead of view. And then just to be extra thorough, maybe to change this name. More than likely you're going to find that you're not using that variable very much, so it doesn't matter that much. And this is really so local. I actually might just call that V. Because it's that hyperlocal. When I'm dealing with lambdas, especially there, it's like, well, a long name may or may not be helpful for that. And it tends to get, if you have a too long name, it tends to get conflicts like we just had. Yeah, so I would actually just rename that one as V. Same thing with my other button. I might just rename this one to V. And that way I get rid of any confusion. So content view is the thing as a whole, and V is the thing that triggered the event. Cool. Cool. And maybe I could have a different name there. That could be the event view or whatever, but again, I usually just try to stick to shorter names when I'm dealing with lambdas, and longer names if I'm not. Okay. So that's one problem down. Another problem that you're going to see is there's down at the end, here you can see 234 to 249. I have some problems because I can't call get intent.
Whenever you guys take a break, I'll leave some pizza out here. If you guys want
Okay.
some free leftover lunch pizza.
Got it.
Not great, but it's something.
Yeah. All right, thank you. So that's one issue we need to solve here. Now, I think I saw when I was looking around that at least one of you had an issue before this. I think I saw somebody else had an issue in their click listeners. Who was that?
Can you say what you said again? I missed it.
Yeah.
So we're creating our intent in our quick listener.
Uh-huh. You said this and probably in here. Yeah. So why are you referring to this in those cases? So look at your compose review button. It should be on your print somewhere.
Mine's in the menu.
Okay. So you're not there yet. I thought you still had a button.
I only have the button for the share. You have the button for the share.
No, you do. You have two right here.
Well,
So expand all
that's
three
right.
names.
These are at the bottom
Yeah.
where the actual list is.
Okay. So there,
So
and
I haven't obviously brought this in yet.
okay, you haven't brought that method in. Go ahead and bring it in and stick it at the other.
Okay.
Because I bet you're gonna have narrow. What's happening there? So you're creating an intent. Anytime you're going to another screen, you're creating an intent. It's referring to this, right? But what is this? What is it actually looking for? And we're creating that. What do you got? We need to change that. Okay. Why did you switch it to activity instead of this? just because, which is kind of right, but except remember that sometimes it's been the lifecycle owner, and sometimes it's been the activity, right? Unfortunately, the activities are a lot of things. They can be a lot of different things. They're lifecycle owners, they're activity, and they're also contexts. Yes?
If you control click on intent there,
Yeah.
where it says equals new intent,
Uh-huh.
it gives you a list of constructors, and one of them it seems like we're using is the one that takes a context and a class.
Right. Yes. So if I go down, I think I have it here. Oh, it's not that one. So yeah, if I go control and I click, go to these, yeah, you're going to find your, where am I? Here.
Maybe it's a context package.
That's the constructor we're using, right? So it's taking a context and it's taking a class, but it's important to pay attention to what that is. The problem, this is one of those problems with Android, is a context is a very poorly defined concept, unfortunately. And so there are a lot of different things that are contexts, okay? Fragments are not contexts, okay? That's part of why this comes up. Fragments are not contexts. Activities are contexts. Services are contexts, which we haven't talked about services, but services are also contexts, which are used for running things in the background. And then you also have the application itself is a context, okay? So as it currently stands, there are 3 different kinds of contexts, okay? And oftentimes things that are taken in context do care. Oftentimes if you provide them the wrong kind of context, things will not work, okay? So I do need to be careful about what kind of context I provide them, okay? So let's say I provided a service context. Well, service context is probably not going to work because services don't really deal with intents. They're doing background stuff. But what about an activity versus the application? Okay. Well, in terms of creating an intent, an activity does always work, right? Part of creating intent is you're changing from one activity to another. Okay. So that's kind of the ideal scenario. I believe I can also provide it says package context, which actually I think means that you could also provide an application context. Either of those are fine, okay? So what I would provide is the activity. The reason I mention that though is because fragments have 2 methods. There's a get activity method, there's also a get context method. And they give you back different things. They don't both give you back the activity, is the reason I mentioned that. Okay, so if you have an intent that you're creating, you just use the activity to initiate it there. Another thing to be wary of, this is a bit of gotcha, is notice that if I'm getting the activity up here, okay, this is an on-view created. Weird thing with actually I think it's fine. Weird thing, but weird vendor with fragments is, remember, fragments can be added and removed. So technically there's this edge case of, well, what happens if when we create this, we're bound to one activity, and when the user clicks on the button, they're bound to another activity.
So we could be passing something that's...
Because potentially, there's a distant potential the get activity could return something different at a later time. Okay? I don't think we have to worry about that here because I do believe, first of all, we're not using this fragment on more than one activity. So I think we're safe there. That we're not using the same instance in more than one activity. And I also think that we are not running into that. But the point there is you may want to call get activity instead of calling this activity variable itself, because that would allow it to do the current thing instead of what it was originally. Again, I don't think you're going to run into that in this particular situation, but sometimes that is a concern. Okay? Cool? All right, so that should cover your issues with starting activity. Okay? If I go further down here, okay, under this logic, 234 on to 250-ish, 249, I'm dealing with an intent. Okay? One of the things to remember, I kind of said this, get intent is not defined here in the fragment. Fragment does not have a get intent method. Okay? So one naive way to work around this would be to do something like this. I'm going to undo this a second, so just let me illustrate it. A naive way to approach this would be to say activity.getIntent, okay, and say, hey, we're just going to get the intent from the activity. The problem is we're kind of intermixing code into the fragment that really doesn't belong to the fragment. There's a reason that there's not a get intent call here, is because, you know, when we're talking about intents, we are talking about activities, so that should be the activity's responsibility. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. So what I need for this code is I'm going to need to do a little bit more work. So I'm going to start by commenting it out. Okay. I'm going to start by commenting it out just to make sure I have a copy of it. Okay. But I'm going to come back to it. Let's look at the next bit of code from the movie details activity. Okay. Effectively, what's going to happen is I'm going to have to put some of that code here in the activity and some code over in the fragment, and figure out how to split that out. So the next method that I have is onState instance state. Okay. Do our fragments have an onSave instance state? Yes, they do. Okay. So in terms of as far as that's concerned, it's actually identical, so I can copy it over verbatim. Although I think that it looks like maybe it isn't protected. Oh, it's public. Okay. So on the activity, it's protected. On the fragment, it's public. That's the only difference there. Okay? So off-save instance state is moved over. Okay? Next method. If I look at on option item selected, okay, on option item selected is specific to activities, right? So when I'm talking about the menu, that's part of the activity, it's not part of the fragment. So everybody get that? Everyone kind of following me there? So this method is going to stay here. It's not going to go over to the fragment. Okay. Same thing if you have an Oncreate options menu, because you might have, if you have an actual menu there, both of those two methods related to the options menu are going to stay. OnBeck pressed, same story. OnBeck pressed is related to the fact that this is an activity, right? And same with handle web link. This really has to do with the really has to do with the handling of that intent, so all of that code's going to stay. Okay? So effectively, I have moved all the code that I need to move over into the fragment. I now have a fragment. Okay? So once I've moved that code over, I also need to take a bunch of code out of the activity. Everybody good with that? So I need a new layout for my detail screen. And so that, I believe, is this one that I created. Let me show you the code for it. I would create a new layout, call it Fragment Container, and slap this in. All it's going to have is a Fragment Container view. What this means is this is a layout. There's only a single thing in there, and it can contain a fragment. So add this layout, call it Fragment Container. And then we'll do the next thing. Okay. Because this is going to end up being the entire layout for the movie details activity, rather than what it was before. Okay, because the fragment contains the rest of it. This is what enables me to use the same fragment in two places. So notice I've given it an ID of Fragment Container. That part's pretty important. Notice that the width and height are both set to match pair. So make sure that those are the same. Cody, you're still typing away? And the reason I just called it Fragment Container is because it's really amorphous to what activity it goes with. It's just, hey, this is a place where I can put a fragment. And so you're likely to find a few different activities where you just want to move it out and have the entire activity be a fragment. Specify its new ID. So plus. All right. So we've got that set up. And so the reason that I need this layout is when I go back to movie details activity, I'm going to go up here, okay, I need to remove a bunch of stuff. So in particular, all of this stuff here is going away, all of these views, and be aware that I'm doing this in the activity and I'm not doing this in the fragment, okay. So in the activity, I'm going to ditch a bunch of code. Okay, so I have these two constants. I have the one movie ID state variable, but that's really it up top. In terms of what is in Oncreate, the layout that I want to use is that new Fragment Container layout. And I'm going to ditch all the middle stuff. So down to here, so I just want to keep the stuff related to the intent.
Can you move? Oh, okay. I see.
Right, so I'm going to start by throwing a bunch of code away because I've already moved it over to the fragment. I don't have to be too careful about that. Now, what we're going to end up here is under views, I'm going to have two things. Private, what was this? This was a fragment container view. Fragment container view. And inside of that, I'm going to end up putting my custom fragments. So movie details fragment, that is my fragment. And so the entire layout, the entire view is going to be composed, whole screen is going to be composed of just those two things. The fragment container and my custom fragment. So for the fragment container, I'm going to create that in, I'm going to get that in Oncreate. So find view by ID, r.id, fragment container. And for the fragment, I'm going to construct that. I think I need to check over here real quick. If I look under the fragment overview, this is kind of where we're going. Create a fragment, add a fragment to an activity, add a fragment programmatically, and so let's see where, there it is. That's what I'm looking for. So this, take that to another screen and use that as a reference. So in the activity, I've got my fragment container, and according to this, I need to call get support fragment manager dot begin transaction. So transaction is the process of changing the fragments that are there. Dot add, and we're going to add into the fragment container now. Is there another version of that? Int and a fragment. Oh, so I think I can do that. So I think I can do it this way. Fragment, construct the fragment first. New movie details fragment, because I do want to end up with a reference to it. And then commit. So start a transaction. It's going to lead to changes in what fragments are visible, make that fragment visible, and then commit those changes. So, in terms of handling, so that's part of the process of setting those up. In terms of working with the intent, here I need to be able to effectively tell the fragment about what the movie ID is, right? So in this case, If we're starting fresh, then effectively I need something like, because we're not referring to the model, I might need to say like fragment dot set movie ID, and I might need to set it to what's there. So rather than calling on the model, I need to kind of call on the fragment. Does that make sense to everybody? So the setter needs to be on the fragment so I can kind of pass that through. On this side, I don't really need that anymore here, so I'm just going to remove it. So I need to have a way to call that. So I'm going to jump back over to the fragment, and we're going to define it. Public void set movie ID, and so that's going to take a string movie ID, determine what's shown, and so this is basically going to be this dot movie ID is equal to movie ID, and this dot model dot fetch movie. I'm going to tell it to fetch that particular movie. Okay. So now there's kind of a setter. There's a pass through to do the code that we had kind of originally done directly in the activity. Cool. Any questions on that? Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Having a setter there? Okay. So that's going to fix this issue. There's still going to be an outstanding issue down under handle web link because handle web link's doing the same thing. So under handle web link, I need to say tell the fragment dot set movie ID and set it to this movie ID there as well. So same thing in both places. Where, because we don't have a reference to the model anymore, I may need to provide that data down to the fragment. Cool. And I think that's largely it. I don't think that let me just see if this works with having made those changes. Because my one outstanding question is, does this work for the case where if I do rotation? So if I go in here, oh, what did I get? Okay. So logcat, attempt to invoke virtual method fetch movie. Okay. So I have a little bit of a gotcha here in that the model may or may not exist yet. Does everybody see that? The model may or may not exist yet. So the reason that that's the case is, remember, this model is being set up here in onViewCreated. In onViewCreated, I create the model, right? Well, onViewCreated doesn't happen immediately when the activity is created. The activity is created first, and then later on, the fragment comes in the screen, and then the fragment expands, inflates its layouts, and then finally this function gets called. So it's at a much later point in time that I have access to the model. Okay? So I can't really call this method at that time anymore, right? Because the model doesn't exist yet. So what can I do? What can I do as a workaround? So there's a time delay here happening, right? So in order to fix the issue with the time delay, I can either move something forward in time or I can move something back in time, right? I can say, hey, let's set it later, or let's create the model earlier. Does that make sense? I can go either way. I can create the model earlier, or I can call this thing later. Okay. Now, do we have the option of calling this later? Can anybody think of a way I could call this later?
We're still talking about the point of view of handle web link, right?
Well, it's actually both ways. It's not even just handle web link. This is straight up when I went there from the list. It crashed when I went to the list. Because both of those cases, whether it's from an implicit intent or an explicit intent, it's before the model's been created. If I just wrap this in a check to see if the null is there, would it fix it? Well, it wouldn't create an exception, but it still wouldn't be set, right? And that's one of the things to miss too, is sometimes it's like, well, I fixed the exception, but you haven't really fixed the bug, right? The bug is a timing problem, the bug is not so much that it's null, okay? So it's not that I need a null check here, it's that I need to change when things happen. Okay, one thing to recognize is one of the things I can't do is I can't make Oncreate take longer. Oncreate actually has to finish before the onView created can get, before the fragment can get created at all. So if Oncreate doesn't finish, then this can't happen, right? So it does have to happen later. Okay. Could I say just delay this to be 3 seconds later?
It's like maybe you have a movie ID as like a live data in your model and like observe when it changes or something like that?
Maybe observe when it changes? What do you mean? I don't have the model right now. Right? My problem is I don't have the model. Gotcha. At all. Model right now is null. So you're shaking your head about I said 3 seconds, you were shaking your head at me. Why is it that I can't just delay it 3 seconds?
You just wait 3 seconds. I'm sure we could start a timer in Java or whatever.
Yeah.
You have to wait 3 seconds if you wanted to, but
I mean, most languages have a way to do that.
why would you want to do that? You're just introducing time into your code.
Time delay, and anytime I introduce time delay, it's a hack,
Definitely.
which doesn't work for everybody. Is the big thing to understand. It doesn't work for everybody. Because if I'm on a slower device, it's going to take longer for that time to occur than if I'm on a fast device. Okay? But even on the fastest device, this is still a timing problem. Okay? It's still a timing problem. It will always be null no matter how fast the device is. Okay? So maybe a better approach, right, might be to try the other direction. Rather than trying to call it later, maybe I try to create the model earlier. Okay? So one of the things I could do is I could look at this. I could say, well, right now it's in onView created. Maybe I could move it to an earlier callback. right? Maybe I could move it to some sort of other on-created method that happens earlier in the chain. There is one. It still doesn't happen early enough, right? There is another on-created method on our fragments, but it's still not early enough in the timeline as what we need it to be, okay? Another thing I could try to do is we could look here and say, oh, well, I'm creating it here. Maybe I create it up in the constructor, okay? Now, the problem implicit in here, and notice that when I create the view model provider, that it takes this, okay? When I create the view model provider, it takes this. That means we're providing ourselves. And unfortunately, our fragment has to be in the right state for this to work. Okay? So I don't really have that option to move it earlier in here. So I think what I'm going to do is something that is not too complicated, but may not be immediately obvious to everybody, is I'm going to actually have this created in the activity itself. So I need a reference to the model here, private movie details. Okay, this is my model. And I'm actually effectively going to tell it to create it twice. So I'm going to ask for it here in the fragment. I'm also going to ask for it here in the activity. Okay, so on the fragment side as well, I'm actually going to just take this method out. And so I won't have the set movie ID method. That's gone. And so what I'm going to do instead is here I'm going to say model.fetchMovie, kind of like we had done before. Model.fetchMovie. Same way down here. Model.fetchMovie, movie ID. And so basically I'm going to roll it back and say, hey, maybe I do need a reference to the model. And so if the activity is creating it, I don't have to worry about the timing, but I do have to worry about the timing if the model is over there in the fragment. Okay? Now, one of the things that may not be obvious is that if I'm creating it in two different places, the activity and the fragment, aren't they getting two different instances of the view model? If I create it in the fragment and I create it in the view model, or create it in the activity, aren't I getting two different instances of this view model? Let's try it out. Oh, okay. So you'll notice when I click on a movie, there's no data appearing. Okay. So what's happening is the fragment and the activity do have two different separate view models, and they have different data in them. right? So the one I'm calling fetch movie on is the one that the activity owns. It's not the one that the fragment owns. Okay? It's the one the activity owns, but not the one the fragment owns. Good news. Let me go look up here. The view model provider. Okay. It actually takes something called the view model store owner. And I believe if I'm clever about this, I believe I can get that to be the same. So I do believe, I think if I take my lifecycle owner and move that up a little bit, so I asked for it down here, but I need it, actually I can probably just move this line down from the looks of it. So I can just say here, this is the lifecycle owner. Is that going to work? Or can I try the activity? Oh, I can try the activity. Yeah. So if I create this one with the activity, in theory, then they're both being created based on the activity, and I should get the same object on both sides, which I do. So basically, I'm letting the activity be the one that creates the view model, and then I just ask for the same view model over in the fragment. Does that make sense to everybody? That does mean there's a short window where with the view model it might be sending out events and trying to fire observers before the fragment comes on screen. But the good news is when the fragment does come on screen, then those observers will basically rewind and go ahead and show the current data. Cool. So it's really just a matter of making sure that the model is created earlier, and because I end up needing to refer to the model both in the fragments and in the activity. We used to have to do all sorts of, before view models were a thing, we used to have to jump through all sorts of hoops to try and keep these two things in sync because it's not easy. And so this is one of those reasons why modern development really requires using these view models. Okay? I think the last thing that's remaining is to just look at the here. Yep, no, I think I did that. I think I took care of all that. So that code's all over. The one gotcha that I have to be aware of is this was setting that movie ID variable. So I need to go into here, into my observer for movie, and I just need to make sure that that gets set appropriate. Now, do I have, actually, I can do this easier because it's not being referred to. Okay, so good news is I'm not using this movie ID variable anymore in the fragment, so I can just cut it out rather than trying to troubleshoot it. So I just take the movie ID out of the fragment, and that allows me to get rid of the code in here that was saving it. And so I don't have to worry about that. Cool. And so I think if I turn it sideways, yay. It's taking its sweet time, but it is switching over. Cool. So does that first step make sense? Our whole goal was to get to the point where there is a lot less code in the activity itself. Okay, we can't get down to 0. I wish we could get down to 0, but we can get as close as possible to 0 to keep the movie ID in there.
And then keep that on the save instance state? Or
Yeah, keep it in the save instance state. I would. Be a good thing to preserve, just in case. That means up here, or it could be more like this. Movie ID is equal to the other way to do it would be to just put it into this listener like so. And that might make more sense, honestly.
It's just having a weird ear.
Yeah.
What? Ready for this?
Oh.
It happens on this one too.
Okay. I bet I can recreate that on my device. Let's see if I can. I know what's going on there.
Is it because of the whole ad thing?
Yes.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
turn it sideways. And yeah, you see it's appearing twice on my screen?
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah. So what's happening here is that it's trying to, remember we talked about save instance state is trying to preserve things? It's trying to preserve fragments that are already there. So in terms of, as far as that's concerned, back in the activity, I lose things. Oh, I lost it. Back in the activity, movie details activity, I'm telling it to add. I need to tell it potentially to remove, or actually just rather replace. I think I just need to tell it to replace. Because otherwise it's adding a new one every time. Yeah, that's it. So it's just a matter of saying replace instead of add.